My name is Don Westblade. I'm very happy to be here at the Global Smyrna meetings. Smyrna, because it's in Turkey, and Turkey is becoming fast one of my favorite travel destinations, but Smyrna because it's the home base of Tutku Tour, and I want to express my appreciation to all their staff for organizing this and for inviting me to be part of it. I'm glad to see them again. But also global, because it's a delight to be in this international community of believers, to have people from many continents coming together. Just a little foretaste of that time when all the peoples and tongues and nations are going to be able to gather together and worship God together and complete our worship in that way. So I'm very glad to be here with all of you. Delighted to have this opportunity to introduce you to Sardis. I teach at Hillsdale College. I've been there for 37 years now. I'll be working on a book on a sabbatical next year on trying to wrap up a book on the Gospels, so you can watch for that down the road. But I teach biblical studies, I teach theology there, and I was diverted into theology. As an undergraduate, I was actually a political science and economics major, and so I'll be talking quite a bit about politics and economics here because that was an early interest of mine. But another reason I'm very glad to be here in Turkey and love to bring students and friends to come along with me is that there's nothing like being in the country to make the biblical story real. So many of my students have no appreciation when they read a verse in the book of Acts that there might be 500 to 1,000 miles of sandal leather and saddle sores represented by the travel in the 3 or 4 city names that are mentioned there. Paul had some, there's my email address, by the way, and I will make these PowerPoints available to anybody who wants to write me for them. I'll put that email address back up at the end of this, so I'm happy to let you have any of these things. But, you know, Paul had some very difficult roads to travel uphill through the Taurus Mountains. These are not easy places for him to travel, and he traveled great distances. And to be able to appreciate that and to know what the early church went through to bring Christianity in their own lifetime as far west as Anatolia and Greece, but in our time throughout the world is an amazing miracle of God, and it's wonderful to be able to study that. So again, I'll be, as we look at Sardis, looking at the politics, the economics, and the history of that, and eventually coming around to try to connect all those things to the message of the book. Now, the name Sardis, I think if you're like most people, I suspect that you might never have heard of this word before, if it weren't for the mention of it in 3 verses in the book of Revelation. Once in the first chapter, as it's part of the 7 cities that are listed there. Twice in chapter 3 when it's mentioned in the context of the letter or sermon. Otherwise, it might as well be a crazy city off in South America or some city in Never Never Land that somebody made up as far as we're concerned. It's just a strange name to us. But 700 years before John's Apocalypse recorded its message to the 7 churches of Asia, Sardis was one of the richest, the most powerful cities in all of Anatolia. It was the capital of the region of Lydia. It had extended its influence into the east, into the region of Phrygia, and up to Mysia and down to Caria, and beyond that over the course of history. Its control over Phrygia included this very important city of Gordion, farther out to the east, which is important in Lydia's story for 2 fairly well-known reasons. The first is that the legendary founder of the city of Gordion was a king by the name of Gordius, whose tumulus, we saw some tumuluses on the road the other day, these tombs that are built for the rich and the powerful of their day that look like small mountains. Here's the tomb at Gordion of Gordius, a city founded by Midas, his son. And Gordius, whose picture I can show you there, was in ancient lore, as you probably know the story, is the one who tied the mythical Gordian knot on a Phrygian ox cart. It was a symbol of his great royal power. There was an oracle at that time that declared that whoever could untie that knot would succeed in ruling all of Asia. And in 333 BC, along comes Alexander the Great, passing through Gordian in his military campaigns. And he solved this impossible puzzle by simply slicing the knot with his sword. And so he went on to become legendary and fulfill the promise by becoming emperor in this vast Hellenistic empire across Asia. Well, that's the Greek version. There's a Roman version of the story that circulates that says Julius Caesar is the one who sliced that knot and gives him all the credit for it. But in either case, Lydia, for all of its earlier power, eventually found itself under the control of these Hellenistic rulers and later on under the rule of Rome. Second important connection with that city of Gordian to Lydia is even more important. The legendary son of Gordius was this king Midas. If you associate that name with mufflers, you've been watching too much television. Most of us are going to associate Midas with the golden touch. What at first seemed like a blessing to Midas, that everything he touched would turn to gold, this blessing from Dionysus quickly turned into a curse, because even his food and drink would turn into gold when he touched it, and he began to starve because of this wonderful gift that he had received. And when he implored Dionysus to take that gift away, Dionysus says the cure would require him to wash in the Pactolus River. And that river flows right past Sardis. We saw it yesterday. And that was the reason why the people who lived in Sardis believed that their river was such an important, rich source of gold for their economy. More about the Pactolus River and its gold in a little bit. Sardis was an ancient city. Most of the history, I'll go back to that slide so you can see the map. Most of the history that I'm going to focus on briefly here is going to take us to the height of Sardis's great power, from about 1200 BC to its conquest by Cyrus the Persian in 546, later on by Alexander in the 4th century, and then by Alexander's Seleucid successors in the 3rd century, and eventually by the Romans once we've met it in the book of Revelation. So if you want to read more of the history of the 7 churches area, you keep wanting me to log into the hotel. There we go, sorry. If you want to read more about the history of the 7 churches, this is the guy to read. Herodotus, who comes from Halicarnassus, today known as Bodrum, is the one who writes the history of this period up through the key 6th century phase of the ascendancy of Sardis, when the city and the Lydian kingdom were in its heyday. So this is the book to read. He was born here in Turkey, and he was a 5th century writer who spent a lot of his lifetime traveling across the Mediterranean world, Egypt, Persia, Mesopotamia, lots of Greek city-states, to gather the information for the books that he wrote. Then, if you want to read more of the history of the wars that occupied the region of the 7 churches in the Hellenistic world, of the Seleucid rulers of the 4th and the 3rd century BC, Polybius is your guy. This historian is a 2nd century writer, born in Greece, but like Herodotus, he traveled all the way through the Mediterranean world collecting material for his histories of the Seleucids that ruled this territory after Alexander. Herodotus it is who tells us that the city of Sardis was established by a man named Ludus, hence the name Lydia. He was a son of Attis, and Ludus gave the rule of Lydia to his descendants, to the descendants of Hercules, so the story goes, around 1185. And these Herculidae ruled for about 500 years until in 680, the last of them is a king named Candaules. Interesting story about him. He's going to be killed by a man named Gyges. Candaules was betrayed to Gyges by his wife because he shamed her. Proud husband that he was of his trophy wife, he invited Gyges into their bedroom to show off to him what a beautiful body she had. His shamed wife turned on her husband by asking Gyges to kill him and marry her in her husband's place, and that's the story of how this new dynasty of Gyges Memnides took over the rule of Sardis. And so you can see that Greek stories don't lack for their spicy entertainment value. Gyges and his son Ardus and here's Gyges, his son Ardus and his son Sardis ruled Lydia from Sardis as the capital for most of the 7th century. Gyges' great-grandson Eleutes saw the largest expansion of this kingdom in his dynasty up to that date. He concluded a treaty with Miletus, opened up the Ionian trade routes to Lydia. He conquered Phrygia. He took control of Caria, parts of Cilicia, and he pushed Lydian influence towards the Mediterranean. Later went on to defeat the Medes in the Battle of Halus, that river that became the border between the Medes and Lydians. And that's a conflict that famously ended because of a solar eclipse. Led to a peace treaty, set the Halus River as their boundary, and then he also married off his son Croesus. Here we go. So he's pushed his kingdom all the way out to this green area is the Medes, and here is Lydia up here among the eastern Phrygians. So back to the family tree. He has a son named Croesus, who begins to reign in 560. Croesus has a sister who is married to Astyages, who is the heir of the kingdom of the Medes under Syarx. Syarx, can't say his name, you read it there. And so Croesus inherited this really powerful, wealthy kingdom that Eleutes had put together for him. And both by consolidating control over his father's conquests and by gaining some influence in additional areas like Paphlagonia and Cappadocia, he brought Sardis to the real zenith of its power, and he enjoyed so many riches that his name becomes synonymous, as many of us might recognize and heard a little bit about yesterday, as a proverbial source of wealth. Everybody refers to the wealth of Croesus. His name is proverbial for wealth as the name Midas is for gold. So great was his reputation for riches that the wise lawgiver Solon actually paid him a visit, came to Croesus in Sardis, but Solon made light of the wealth of Croesus, planted the thought in him that there might be something more important and satisfying in life than riches. That story will come back actually to help Croesus in good time. We're pausing here with Croesus to dwell at some greater length on this figure because his is one of the stories that we want to return to when we relate Sardis to the letter that gave its place as one of the 7 churches of Revelation. In the meantime, as Herodotus is going to go on to tell us, Croesus was not only the wealthiest man in the known world of his time, he was also a king who in the end found himself in his kingdom beset by tragedy upon tragedy. First of all, there's a young prince in Phrygia by the name of Adrastus. He is the son of another Gorgias, who in turn was the son of another Midas. These are not the same ones that we spoke about earlier. And this Gorgias was, Adrastus, the grandson here, is the one who killed his own brother unintentionally and got exiled from Phrygia by his father for it, and Croesus gave Adrastus asylum in Sardis. And later, Croesus asked him, Adrastus, would you watch over my son, because his son Attis, he had learned in a dream, was destined to be killed in his youth by a spear. Tragic turn of irony, it came about that on a hunting expedition, Adrastus, who's supposed to be the protector of Attis, hurled his spear at a boar and accidentally hit Attis instead, killed him. And so in his grief and remorse, Adrastus finally took his own life. And Croesus saw the future hopes of Gyges' Smyrna dynasty die with the loss of his son. Second tragedy that Croesus faced, not only did he lose his heir, he lost his kingdom. About 2 years after the death of his son, alarm bells are going to go off in Lydia because his brother-in-law Astyages, king of the Medes, was overthrown in a coup by his grandson Cyrus. Yes, this is the same Cyrus who a dozen years later is going to conquer Babylon and allow the exiled people of Judah there to return and rebuild Jerusalem. So you've heard of him before, book of Isaiah. Cyrus then was the grandson of Astyages through his mother, but he was the son of Cambyses, the king of Persia. So in overthrowing his grandfather, Cyrus succeeded in uniting the Medes and the Persians into the next major world power that would not only conquer all of Anatolia, but important parts of Greece and Macedonia and Europe as well. I don't know how to make that thing stop asking me to log on. Croesus is going to go into the Delphic oracle to ask whether he should attempt some kind of attack for the threat of the approaching forces of Cyrus from Persia. And the answer that came back from the Delphic oracle is that if he should march against the Persians, he would destroy a great empire. Well, mistakenly assuming that by a great empire the oracle meant that the Persians would be destroyed, he led the Lydians into war in 546, only to learn that the great empire that he was about to destroy was his own. So, if the loss of life didn't seal the end of the Smyrna dynasty, the loss of his kingdom surely did. Taken away as a prisoner to Persia, he came this close to being burned alive for his ambitions, but his life was spared in the end when Cyrus saw him on the pyre of fire and heard him uttering the name of Solon on that fire and said, "We've got to save this guy. I respect Solon," and he ordered him to be released. It was almost too late. Fortunately for Croesus, a sudden providential rainstorm made it possible for Cyrus to rescue him at the very last moment, put the fire out. From this point on, Sardis has its importance under the Persians, not as an independent capital, but as a key city in the Persian Empire along the King's Road that's going to lead from Persia all the way over to Ephesus on the west. Now, politics that I've been talking about bleed into economics and vice versa. My major was called political economics for a reason. A major source of the wealth, the economy that enriched Croesus and that powered Lydia's war machine, was the growing exploitation of the gold that was coming down from the Tmolus mountain through the Pactolus River. Panning for gold in the Pactolus River was becoming increasingly lucrative, something akin to the gold rush days of 1849 in California, perhaps. And Gyges, back in the 7th century, is already described in Sardis as rich in gold. But it seems likely that the minting of gold and silver into coins begins rather with his great-grandson Elaetes. So we find lots of coins around Sardis. The coins from the reign of Elaetes were refined in those ruins of those buildings that we saw yesterday as we drove by the Pactolus River. It seems like the minting, though, begins with Elaetes, not with Gyges. The coins from Elaetes' reign in the early 6th century, primarily an alloy of gold and silver that's called electrum, that probably came primarily from mines up in the north near Troy. Sardis had its own refineries, as we see here, by the river for separating gold and silver from electrum that they were bringing in from Troy. And these were excavated recently in the 60s. After Eliates, under his son Croesus, coins began to be minted out of pure gold. And the ancient Greeks actually called these gold pieces cresids. So the electrum is this mixture of silver and gold. The cresids are pure gold. So a couple of quick asides as we pass through that particular topic. One is that the Greek word for gold happens to be the Greek word krusis. And a lot of the travel blogs that I look at assume that the Greek word is probably derived from Croesus's name, since they sound so much alike, but this Greek word has already occurred some centuries before in the writings of Homer. It's obviously a mistake to think that it begins with Croesus, although I suppose it's possible to conjecture that Croesus's name derives from the Greek word for gold, which seems associated earlier with shiny things. So good name to give your son. Either way, the king's name is associated with these gold coins that bear his name, the cresids of the ancient world. And the history does seem to bear out the testimony of Herodotus and Xenophon that Lydia, with Sardis at its heart, is the place where economies of barter are going to first give way to an economy of minted, coined money, which I am now discovering is probably giving way as I travel to an economy of plastic and chips. It's sort of providential. As I was working on these coins back in May, on the 22nd of May, the U.S. Treasury Department made its announcement that it's about to phase out the penny. So we're kind of standing at the historic bookends of history, studying Sardis and the minting of coins, at a moment at which the minting of coins is just about to be phased out in favor of other kinds of monetary exchange. So history's being made here just like it is in Nicaea. A second aside. Until rather recently, it's been long assumed that the metal in the Pactolus River was primarily electrum, and that's the reason for the refineries alongside the river. They were there to separate the gold out of the electrum so they could make the cresids, and that only later did Lydians discover how to refine that into those components of gold and silver. But I want to quote here from an article that started in 2010 but was given a new edition in 2020 by Nicholas Cahill, who is the leader of the archaeological explorations at Sardis. He wrote just a few years ago, recent analysis of natural gold from these streams and others around Sardis reveal that the ore contains virtually no silver. It's essentially pure gold. So the idea that electrum was the initial metal is probably mistaken. They were getting their electrum from other places. But, as he says, this raises a number of new questions about Sardis. If the Lydians had pure gold, why were they minting electrum coins? And where did that electrum really come from? And second, if the gold from the stream was pure, what were the Lydians refining at their industrial complex? So those are still kind of new, unanswered questions. Some things for you aspiring archaeologists and historians that might be in the audience to pursue at some point. To return then to the main point, gold in the Pactolus River, together with the innovation of minting it into coins, is a major reason why Sardis, especially under Croesus, became a wealthy and powerful capital of much of Western Anatolia. Coined money on the gold standard made trade a lot more easily negotiable, not only regionally, but eventually beyond Lydia's borders. It made paying soldiers a long way away on the frontier a lot more efficient. And of course, it was a way of turning their natural resource into wealth for them. And so that Sardis is arguably the first place on Earth in history to mint and employ coins means that modern monetary systems have their roots deep in these metal refineries and coin stamping industries of Lydia, and particularly of our city, Sardis. Greece is one of the anchor points that we're going to come back to as we get back to the message of the letter to Sardis. But his 14 years of the city's history have a lot of ancestry, also have a lot of successors that I want to give a bit of attention to before we look at the angel's letter. So here we go again. Should have just logged on. In the Middle and Late Bronze Age, the Hatti, later the Hittites, who came from the west and assimilated into the east part of Anatolia, assimilated a lot of the local Hatti culture and dominated quite a bit of Anatolia. Sardis was an outpost of that Hittite empire in this region called Arzawa down in the southwestern corner. Eventually came to be part of that whole Hittite empire with its capital up here at Hattushas. There's evidence of some habitation and Arzawa culture and settlements here at this Sardis location from the second millennium period, and more recent excavations up by those terrace houses that we passed by, up on the rise below the citadel, have pushed even further, some 40 years down into the bedrock underneath those houses, and they've unearthed pottery that archaeologists are dating now to the early Bronze Age in the 3rd millennium BC. Here is Nicholas Cahill, who I mentioned a little bit earlier, who, as he is reporting on these discoveries at the Harvard Art Museum back in 2018, noting how deep those excavations have gone and how rich of the deposits are much earlier than we had found before. Cahill himself, by the way, was a student of Crawford Greenwalt, who was in turn a student of the founder of the Harvard-Cornell archaeological expedition, George Hanfmann. And there was actually some important initial work even done before him by the American Society for the Excavation of Sardis that was founded, directed by Professor Howard Crosby Butler from Princeton University. That was back in 1910 to 1914, a little bit more in 22. All of their work tells us that Sardis was heir to a very long history of earlier cultures, from the Hatti to the Hittites with their capital at Hattushas, the Arzawa of the Luvians, the Ludu, and eventually, after the collapse of the Hittite Empire around 1200, the Lydians that we've been speaking about. On the later side of the Lydian culture, we've already seen how the Persians conquered Sardis, built their empire toward the west through Anatolia and into Greece. Cyrus and his successors were the superpower of the late 6th through much of the 4th centuries, as you probably know, until in 333 along comes the son of Philip of Macedon, Alexander the Great, born in 356, unites the Greek world, pushes back against the Persians, and finally conquered them while he was still in his 20s. By about 334, Sardis is now in the hands of Alexander and in the hands of his mission to Hellenize, that is, to make Greeks out of all the former empire of these Persians. But Alexander's control had a life as short as his own. He died 10 years later in 323, no son, very young. His empire got divided up among his generals, of whom Seleucus and his Seleucid ancestors are going to play the dominant role until about 214, when things are going to change among the Seleucids. So the Seleucid Empire is this yellow portion run from Syria but all the way out to almost the Indus River where Alexander had gone. The green is the Ptolemies, and up here are we've heard about Lysimachus and Cassander, who were generals that took that northwestern part of things. But for a moment, I want you to kind of keep your eye on this strategic little neck of green, this Ptolemaic territory, another one of Alexander's generals, that is very important, of course, for biblical history in Israel. In about the year 200 BC, the great-grandson of Seleucus, king named Antiochus III, managed to wrestle that little green area of Judea away from the Ptolemies of Egypt. And there's Antiochus III, and to bring that under Seleucid control in the 5th Syrian War, around 200. His son is a guy named Antiochus IV, known by the Jews as formerly Antiochus Epiphanes, the appearance of God among them, known behind their breath as Antiochus Epimanes, Antiochus the Crazy. He'll be well known to students of biblical history because this is the king who desecrates the temple. This is the abomination of desolation that we read about in the Synoptic Apocalypse. And because he installed his own statue in the Holy of Holies instead of the Ark of the Covenant there. And so this is what the New Testament refers to as that desolating sacrilege. Provoked the Hasmonean family of a priest named Mattathias into organizing a rebellion against the rule of Antiochus IV. And this is the family that comes to be known as the Strong, or the Hammers, or as we know them, the Maccabees. But our interest in Sardis is going to take us back a little bit earlier to a family clash between Antiochus III and a cousin of his named Achaeus. Achaeus is a cousin through his mother who married Andromachus. Achaeus is going to be installed by Antiochus, who's running most of Anatolia by this time, as a kind of governor or king in Sardis in 214. And Polybius is the one who's going to recount this history for us as we move the yellow farther and farther west. Polybius in his histories, books 7 and 8, recount for us this history of the expansion of the Seleucids into Anatolia. In 223, Antiochus appointed Achaeus to be the governor of all of Asia Minor. Then Achaeus, a few years later, decided to rebel against his cousin Antiochus and declared himself king, and he made Sardis his home base for all of that. Antiochus then came to try to suppress his cousin's rebellion by laying siege to Sardis, and Antiochus was successful in capturing the lower city of Sardis because of the help of a guy named Legarus, and we'll hear his story from Polybius in a few moments. He's also able to gain control of the upper Acropolis because of some other trickery and treachery by another fellow named Bolus. Those things will be important as we think about the letter. And finally then, Antiochus is going to take control of that whole citadel of Sardis when Achaeus' wife surrendered the whole business to Antiochus. It's all now Seleucid. And then the history of Sardis after Antiochus gained control of the city. It's kind of a microcosm of the splintering of old Hellenistic empire of Alexander, this incremental displacement by the Romans who were about to build their own long empire out of the pieces that once were Seleucid and Ptolemaic, including Africa, Gaul, Germanica. And so the story from the Seleucids forward is stories that we've actually heard some already. I'm not going to repeat them because we got some good stories this morning from Pergamum, which is going to take over this part of the territory, the Attalids. And eventually, so 213, the city is now a center for the Seleucids. 190, Pergamum, who we heard about this morning, allies itself with Rome, defeated Antiochus at the battle that we heard about, and then by a treaty, the Seleucids cede most of Asia Minor to Pergamum and that Attalid dynasty. Sardis, now no longer a capital of Lydia, has become a provincial capital, and Attalus is going to bequeath his kingdom to Rome, as we learn. 17 AD, we've heard about this big earthquake in this part of the world, and Tiberius sent funds. Laodicea refused them, but Sardis accepted them, and they received that title Neocorus that we've heard about earlier, became the custodian of the imperial temple there for the first time in 17 AD. They'll get that title one more time a little bit later. Hadrian is going to visit them in 123 AD and bestow that second Neochorus title upon them, and that's partly when the Artemisium that we saw, the Temple of Artemis, got its redesign and lots of new developments. Never quite completed, but got a lot of money from Rome through Hadrian to work on that temple that we saw yesterday. Construction of the gymnasium is going to begin under that same time of Hadrian, when the money's starting to pour back in from Rome to rebuild the city. And here's an artist's reconstruction of what the city might have looked like around the 3rd century after Hadrian's money and some of the other emperors came through to rebuild it. It really was a beautiful and massive city. You can see how large the gymnasium has become by this time. This was a major city in the middle of Anatolia. So it's under Rome where most of the construction of these great buildings arose, whose remains that we saw yesterday at Sardis. And it was now by the 3rd century regaining a lot of the kind of municipal status that it had enjoyed at one time, in greater measure earlier, back in the days of Croesus. The gymnasium that we saw, one of the largest bath complexes in the empire, built in the 2nd century and on into the 3rd. Several pictures of things that you saw yesterday to show the grounds of that gymnasium, just to remind you where we were. And the pools, the baths that were behind there that still await some restoration. But if you'd like a visualization from an artist's rendering of what that bath might have looked like back in its heyday, there is one artist's attempt to do that. Here's another one. Something like that is what that bath might have looked like back when it was complete and not a ruin as we saw. The synagogue is next door. Sometime in the 3rd or 4th century, that bath gymnasium complex was remodeled for civic functions, council meetings and such. And eventually that section was repurposed for the synagogue with those mosaics, with the statues, the marble table. All of that gave us one of the largest Jewish synagogues in the empire. You'll recall seeing some of this when I took these pictures. There was still no covering over that, no carpets to walk on, but beautiful evidences of Roman art. That now are eventually covered to protect the mosaics and other things under there from the elements. Temple of Artemis that we saw has an even longer history. An early beginning under Seleucus I and Antiochus I, that's back about 281 BC. Statement in that Hellenistic capital city that Greek culture is here, asserting itself. But construction didn't progress very much past that interior sanctuary. That you can kind of see in here. The outer parts were unfinished at that time until the time of Hadrian, when work got commenced again, along with the work on the gymnasium. That bestowal of a second Neochorus honor invited a lot of investment in the city's architecture, but even then, this temple was never really completed before it fell into some disuse under the growing Christian influence of Rome after Constantine in the 4th century. By the time we get to the 9th and 10th centuries AD, landslides from up above the mountain and the citadel are coming down from the Acropolis, almost buried the temple, leaving just the tops of some of the columns still visible for people who reported seeing it in the 18th and 19th century. And now we've been able to see at least the remnants of the foundation. Underneath that, so here's some reporting on the Temple of Artemis. Some of the beautiful columns that are reconstructed in museums. reminder of the colossal sizes of the columns that were there. You saw these firsthand yesterday, so I'll kind of breeze through those. The Acropolis that is up there behind it was the fortress, the citadel into which the city could withdraw and for protection when necessary. Now what's buzzing? Something's buzzing. I'm not sure what it is, but I'm going to ignore it. Do you hear this buzzing? I'm not sure.
This is your fun?
Yeah.
It's horse.
Okay. We'll ignore the sound. Hopefully it will cool down. All right, so back to the citadel, the Acropolis. This is where people are going to withdraw for protection when they needed some place to hide when advancing armies are coming. And that citadel is a reminder to us. Here's a kind of a look from the terrace houses. The gymnasium's out here. It's kind of a look on the map from about here, that direction. You can see the gymnasium here. And you can also see the road that we came through, and we saw some rubble that's newly forming here around the gymnasium where that road was. That rubble that is here was remnants of a gate, artistic reconstruction of what that gate might have looked like is here that we saw yesterday. Something massive like that, and so large that when you put it next to the Arch of Titus in Rome, for scale you can see just how big that gate would have been in Sardis. The citadel up at the top was supposedly a safe place to protect all the wealth of Sardis. It was proud of its wealth, it was proud of its political power, and now that they have all this wealth, they're going to have to rely upon their own accumulated resources and their citadel in order to protect all of that. And that's where our story picks up to tell us about the message of the letter. Read in Herodotus in his histories about the story that we heard briefly yesterday as we visited here. This is Herodotus directly speaking to us. The 14th day after Croesus began to be besieged by Cyrus. Cyrus made proclamation that he would give gifts to anybody who could get over the wall. And the army tried and failed, and after the rest had ceased from the attack, a certain guy came along whose name was Heroides, and he tried to make an approach on the side of the citadel where no guard had been set. The people of Sardis didn't have any fear that they were ever going to be taken from that unapproachable side. The side of the citadel, very precipitous at that point, unassailable. But this is the story we heard. He saw on the day before how one of the Lydians descended on that side of the citadel to go back and find a helmet that had dropped and recovered it, and watched how he climbed back up the wall and saw how to get into the city on that sort of secret way. And because of that, Sardis was finally taken and the whole city was given up to plunder. This was in 546. Polybius is going to tell a similar story in the 3rd century BC. Now that Sardis has rebuilt itself as a Seleucid city, around it, lots more skirmishes are taking place. When you get wealthy, people want to take your money. And finally they besieged the town, and a certain Cretan named Lagarus came up. He had a lot of experience in war. He learned that as a rule, cities fall into the hands of their enemies most easily from some kind of neglect on the part of their inhabitants, trusting in the artificial strength of their defenses that we saw pictures of, neglecting to keep proper guard, becoming thoroughly careless. He had observed also that in cities like this, captures were effected at the points of greatest strength, believed to have been despaired of by the enemy. So he saw that the prevailing notion of the strength of Sardis caused the whole army to despair of taking it and to believe that the one hope of getting it in was by starving it out. That's what the siege works usually did. And he scanned all the ways of trying to get in and saw that there was a portion of the wall unguarded near a place called the Saw. Conceived this hope and idea of his exploit, discovering that the carelessness of the men guarding the wall from this circumstance. The place was very precipitous, a deep gully below which dead bodies and offal of horses and beasts were tossed over. And there was always a lot of vultures and other birds collecting there. And when he saw that those creatures were full, they always sat up on the cliffs undisturbed and figured out that the wall must be left unguarded and deserted there. So under cover of night, he went to the spot, examined the possibilities of approaching it, finding this was possible, reported all the facts to the king, and they made their preparations, came by stealth to the foot of the cliffs, scaled it in that unprotected place, and no one suspected what was going on, and this is how Antiochus became the master of Sardis. Almost a repeat of the 300-year before episode that Herodotus tells about. Okay, that'll work. By the stealth of Lagarus, then, they lost the lower city. Achaeus lost the high city, the citadel, by the cunning of another guy named Bolus, whose story I'll only summarize a little bit. Achaeus took all his precautions, but Polybius has this moral to draw from the story that he tells. This is Polybius saying, Achaeus' fate, giving into the treachery of this other guy, Bolus, teaches posterity two useful lessons. Don't put faith in anybody lightly. Don't be overconfident in the hour of prosperity. In human affairs, there is no accident that we might not expect. So Polybius is already drawing this conclusion, and this is now a thing about which Sardis has become self-conscious in its own history. We have been attacked twice because people have snuck in and taken us when we weren't really watching. So what does the letter from the angel in Revelation have to say? Write this to Sardis. I know your works. You have a reputation of being alive, but you are dead. Wake up. Strengthen what remains and is about to die. I've not found your works complete, so remember what you've received. Keep it and repent. If you don't wake up, I will come like a thief. Sardis has had several episodes in its own history to remind them and to be quite embarrassed and ashamed that a thief has managed to sneak in when they were thinking that they were safe, thinking that they had protected themselves well by their citadel. And Revelation, this letter to them, is playing upon their own self-consciousness and their own shame of having slept through the attack by a thief. This could happen again, is what the angels were telling the people of Sardis. One other message that they hear here is, I've not found your works complete. Think about that temple of Artemis. Wasn't complete when they started to build it under the Seleucids. Still didn't get complete, even under the contributions of the Romans. There are allusions in this letter to history about which the people of Sardis would have been painfully aware, and this letter would have stung them, I think, pretty hard, and probably ought to sting the rest of us because we are kind of accustomed to relying upon our own accumulated resources to protect ourselves. And there's a message to us also to wake up, because it's very easy for someone to sneak in just when we think we're secure. I didn't watch my money very much when I was a student because I didn't have very much of it. I didn't think very much about what to do to take care of it. When you get older and you watch people around you who are rich, what are they spending most of their time doing? They're finding financial advisors, they're finding places where they can store their money in a bank, and they spend an awful lot of time thinking about their protecting the resources that they've accumulated. And those are the times when we need most to watch out. Our churches, especially in most of the countries represented here, are pretty rich churches. There's a message here in the letter to Sardis to wake up. Thieves can come in. We need to protect our faith. I'll stop there and see. I don't know, we're probably out of time. I think I've got a minute over, so I'm not sure if there's time for questions, but I'll be happy to talk afterwards with anyone.